So I think we'll go ahead and get started here. I'm quickly going to stop the video, stop the sharing to introduce folks. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tim Ogden, the Managing Director of the Financial Access Initiative and leader of the Small Firm Diaries. Joining me today for this webinar on the global findings from the Small Firm Diaries and what that means is Paddy Carter from British International Investment, and the tasteful logo in the upper right corner of his screen. Hilary Miller-Wise from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Payal Dalal from the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth, and Meki from the University of Oxford. Our goal today is to share quickly some of the results of the Small Firm Diaries. And I want to be clear that this is not a complete overview of the findings. We are going to go through this very, very quickly. You will find on the Small Firm Diaries website, smallfirmdiaries.org, a complete set of the expanded slides that I'll show today with a lot more background information. And on the smallfirmdiaries.org website, country reports for most of the countries where the study has been conducted that goes into a lot of detail behind this. But today, the goal is not just to share results of those findings, but as I said, to think about what those findings might mean and how we think about what the needs of small firms are, how we can iterate program, policy, product to support small firms, ultimately in the goal of economic development and poverty reduction. So with that, let me share my screen again, and we'll go through the quick overview of what we'll be doing today. The diaries findings, then into a discussion with our panelists, and there will be plenty of time for Q&A. Please feel free to use the chat or the Q&A function during the session so that you can register questions, and our panelists will be free to answer questions that are easy to answer in that format along the way. So let's get into the global findings overview. Boiling it down into 4 key findings and 4 recommendations, and we'll start going through these. The 4 key findings. First, that small firms, and we'll talk about exactly what we mean by small firms because that's really critical here, are a distinct group and different in material and important for policy and product ways from micro enterprises and medium-sized enterprises. Second, that there is a large group of these small firms that we have decided to call stability entrepreneurs, using both of those terms very specifically. Stability, because they are seeking stability as an important aspiration for their firms, but entrepreneur in the classic sense of the word entrepreneur, not just someone who started a business, but someone who started a business with the intention of owning a business and having it grow, and they aspire to growth. But they aspire to growth with stability. And so that is the largest group of the firms in our sample fit this characteristic, and we are calling them stability entrepreneurs. Third, that the main missing ingredient for these firms is access to working capital, not asset capital, and we'll come back to talk more about that. And then finally, that the workers in these firms are in a very interesting situation that deserves a lot of attention. One, the jobs are fragile in the sense that they come and go very, very frequently, even within the year, and that the workers in these jobs are meet many of the classic definitions of poverty, the kinds of people that anti-poverty programs should be targeting. What should we do about those findings? 4 things we'll focus on. One is, I jokingly call this death to MSME, that category is not a useful category because the differences between micro entrepreneurs, small firms, and medium-sized enterprises are so large in meaningful ways that the group category obscures more than it reveals. Second, that we really need to start thinking about redesigning programs and policies around things that are appropriate for these stability entrepreneurs, not just targeted at high growth aspiration firms. Third, that we need to figure out how to offer working capital. And this isn't just a browbeating, the banks have the wrong product. Offering working capital is really, really hard. And if we want to make it work, fill this need for these small firms, we're going to have to do some innovative things to make it possible and sustainable in the market. And then finally, that we need to focus on the small firm jobs themselves, not just on the firms, because there's not a guarantee that gains for the firms will automatically be passed down to the workers. So you'll hear me use small firms throughout this discussion, and we have a very specific definition of small firms that you see here, that those firms are firms that offer paid work to one or more up to 20 non-family workers, that these businesses are a mix of formal and informal, and they do have access to formal finance. We did conduct this study, by the way, in 6 main countries. Uganda is a 7th country where we have been running a couple of RCTs to further illuminate some of the mechanisms and better understand. And so stay tuned as we have preliminary results from those that we'll be sharing later in the year. So you see the 6 main countries there and when we conducted the study. Let's dive into those findings. As I mentioned, a distinct group. What you see in this chart is various ways of looking at how banked the firms are. And the first way is the classic definition: do they own an account that they use for the business? Almost all of the firms, substantially more than 60% in almost every country, own bank accounts that they use for the business. We take some guidance from the Findex and then start asking, do you use that bank account as recorded in their cash flows? And you can see that there is a drop to the firms that use the account at least once during the study, and a really significant drop to the firms that process more than 25% of their transactions through that account. But it is still a substantial number of these firms. And this is where we said that they are quite distinct from the micro enterprises, where often the question is, how do we get them banked in the first place? But you'll also note that these firms really do still rely on cash. They have not transitioned to formal transaction mechanisms in the sense of using bank-to-bank transfers or even using mobile money. And you'll be unsurprised to see that Kenya is an outlier there. But there is mobile money use. Also note that mobile money use in Nigeria, various forms of digital transactions have gained rapidly since the study started. We saw the beginnings of that in the study, and it has continued since we left the field. But you'll also see here that the firms are not part of the microfinance ecosystem. Very, very few of the firms use microfinance. These are not firms that started with access to microfinance loans and grew to this size. And we generally already knew that from many of the studies of microfinance, is that very, very few of those firms grow. What we are finding is these firms started, as we see in almost every other developed country in the world, is that a firm that starts without employees almost never hires them. Almost all employment in small firms comes from firms that started with paid workers. So let's now talk about this distinct group within the distinct group, the stability entrepreneurs. And I want to focus here on the canonical idea of business that's illustrated in that little video. The very rapid growth, the words gazelles or cheetahs or rapid growth businesses are often tossed around in some of these policy conversations. And the fact is that what we see from the firms is their experience is not a desire to do something kind of crazy like put a jet ski engine on a small boat and take off like that. Is the environment they're operating in is more like we see in this video. The waves, the ups and downs are significant. And trying to go fast in an environment like this is a recipe for disaster. And the firms are smart enough to understand that that's not desirable, That's not what they want. And as we come back, the issues there are magnified in the fact that if you think about that video there of the boat going up and down the swells, it's hard to tell whether that boat is actually making any progress. To put some more distinct view on that, here are just 4 different firms from the study where you can see their month-by-month revenue, expense, and margins, and how much volatility these firms experience, and how hard it is to even tell what the trajectory is of these firms, even when we have long-term data on them. When we ask the firms themselves what they desire, their aspirations for their firm, you can see that the largest group, and this is across the global study, the largest group aspire to growing profit, but also growing their stability. And these are the firms that we refer to as stability entrepreneurs. And when you look at those firms, here we have 2 examples where we try to estimate their long-term trajectory. And if you ignore for a moment that we've drawn a smooth line, an estimate of their trajectory, trying to take into account volatility, seasonality, and industry trends, you can see just based on their revenue line, it's kind of hard to tell where these firms are headed. But you'll also note that even those estimated monthly growth figures are heavily dependent on when you start and end within this time frame. So for instance, this firm on the left, the animal feed producer in Nigeria, if you remove that month of October, their estimated monthly growth is closer to 1.5% than 4%. For the firm in Colombia, if you remove that August date, actually their trajectory declines some because when you factor in seasonality and what's happening in some industry trends, some other things going on in that firm, in fact, it changes the perspective. Understanding the trajectory of firms is very, very difficult. So in addition to thinking about these as stability entrepreneurs, it really, I think our findings undermine the idea that we can effectively identify which firms are likely to rapidly grow, and which firms are struggling, and what the trajectory of firms are. It's a really difficult thing to do. So what do the firms need? They need liquidity. And continuing with our nautical theme here, one of the things I've seen as we go around talking about this is so much of product and program and policy is focused on this idea of getting better assets, more assets to the firms. This idea of this boat with 3 engines. When we talk to the firm owners, what we see is their primary concern is not adding another machine, adding another location, adding real estate, adding fixed capital. It's that they don't have enough gas to run the machines that they've already got. When we ask the firms about their barriers to success, unsurprisingly in the environment, and when we conducted the study, supply costs, where we had this global inflationary moment around emerging from the pandemic, were a big issue. But you also see that access to finance is a big issue for the firms in their self-perception. But when we delve into that a little bit more and ask them what they would want to use a loan for, we see that a substantial portion of them want to use loans to address cash flow issues or buy inventory and raw materials. You do see a substantial portion that say that they want to use a loan to make an investment. But we also delved into the data to see when firms are making large purchases, those are almost always for raw materials, not capital goods. And when we look back at loans that they had at the start of the study and what they used them for, substantial majorities of them were using their loans for working capital. We also see here why working capital matters so much is the use of supply chain finance. One, these firms are suppliers of liquidity to their customers. You see a substantial portion of them are giving credit to customers. Their customers are low-income households who have trouble paying for things, and so they work out financing arrangements with their customers. But they're also looking for credit from their suppliers, often, and using that credit to manage their cash flow, but not to the extent that would help them gain stability. And our final mental image here is around what happens to the workers. So hopefully this will, there we are. Here is a prototypical image of a firm. When it hits the rapids, the workers go overboard. And that's what we see in amongst the firms themselves. So when we started out this study, we talked about employees. As we looked at the data, we've worked very hard to drop the use of the word employees from our language because we think that the word employee implies something that we don't see in practice. And that is that the jobs in these firms are very short-lived. So what you see in this chart is 74% of the paid workers in the study across the world were paid less than 8 months of the 10 months that we use in our data analysis. Only 27% of the workers were paid for at least 8 of the 10 months. But beyond that, it's not just whether the job exists, it's how much volatility there is in the pay they get from those jobs. So the coefficient of variation, or CV, is just a way of measuring the volatility of those payments. And a way to think about this is from month to month, the average worker's income from the job is varying around 30 to 40% change from month to month. It is changing above 40%. And that amount of volatility does not meaningfully decrease even for the employees who are regular employees, who are paid out of the 10 months. They have experienced a little less volatility, but not a huge change. And to make that a little bit more real, here's a chart for a firm in Indonesia that shows the workers. And as I mentioned, we're trying to get employees out. We haven't gotten it out of this chart yet. But you see that there's one worker here who's paid in every month, but the amount they are paid changes dramatically. And then you see other workers coming and going throughout the study. That is really emblematic of what we see in many, many of the firms. And when you look at the household economic situation of these workers, we see that nearly half of them say that they lack the money to meet basic needs during the study. The workers in these firms meet many of the classical definitions of being poor. So what does that mean in terms of recommendations? I covered this briefly, but I just wanted to come back to them, that small firms are a distinct group, and we need to unbundle the MSME category and focus on what are the needs of the different types of firms. Second, we really need to think about designing around the stability entrepreneur category and what those people need that helps them grow, but at a measured pace that increases their stability. One way to do that is to innovate ways to offer working capital access to those firms so that they can increase their stability. And then finally, really think about the workers in these firms and how we can support those workers, make those jobs more stable, make those jobs better, and make sure that the growth flows through to meet our anti-poverty goals. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and come back to the panelists. Thank you for bearing with me. I hope I didn't race through that too quickly or too slowly, for that matter. But I wanted to start here in our discussion for the rest of our time here and talking about, what does all this mean with Mohammed, who has been doing a number of experiments around in different locations on trying to innovate credit to firms, micro and small. Mohammed, I'm thinking specifically of two particular studies that you've run. One in Pakistan that has an element of both equity as a model for providing capital, but is asset capital, and a program in Kenya that is more of a working capital, but also has some equity-like features to it. Could you just very quickly describe these two studies and what you take away from them, not just from the impact analysis, but what it means for how we think about um, providing access to capital for these firms?
Sure. Thank you, Tim, and thank you everyone for joining. Before I talk about those two papers that Tim has asked me to discuss, just maybe some reflections on some of the results from the Small Firm Diaries. I mean, one of the things that really stood out for me is, as you've seen many surveys, these firms cite access to finance as a major barrier to their growth. At the same time, they're saying to you, we don't want loans. Most of them are saying to you, we don't want loans. And so there are lots of stories you could tell. There could be like a mistrust of the formal financial system. Many of them are using informal finance, the firms that you're studying, right? So it's a little bit puzzling, but there are plausible explanations along the lines of perhaps the appropriate type of financing for the investment requirements that they have is just not available to them. And I think you discussed specifically working capital financing, but I think the overall story is consistent with where we are on the microfinance literature. Many of the people sitting in this room have made in this current session have made major contributions to microfinance. I won't summarize it here, but just as a very quick recap, we have this kind of first wave of experimental evaluations of microcredit, which initial headline result was that there wasn't anything transformational happening, but subsequently we see there's lots of nuance there, right? There's some heterogeneity, and as I said, people in this room have contributed to those studies, thinking about general equilibrium effects, but that heterogeneity often led to those terms like gung-ho entrepreneurs, and you've just added a new term to our library. Thank you very much, Tim. I'm sure everyone would appreciate that. But I think we all appreciate now that there is nuance there, but perhaps and some people just need it for consumption purposes, and that's important, right? And Jonathan's written a lot about that, right? But for the subset who perhaps do aspire to grow, the rigidity of the traditional contract may not be the most appropriate financial structure to really allow you to take longer term investments. And so, people are doing great work on thinking about tailoring of repayments to be better aligned with the cash flow cycles. Also thinking about specifically female entrepreneurs and how do you actually disperse and collect. Emma's sitting in this room as well. And so I think, that need for better tailored finance is definitely consistent with where we are in the literature. Just referring to the two papers that you mentioned, we've definitely been working in that space of thinking about how can we tweak the existing contract to perhaps allow more risk sharing to be embedded within it. And it speaks to that volatility that you discussed. People often have very volatile revenue streams, and perhaps there is value in having some contracts where the repayments are better aligned with those streams. And in an era where there's a greater digital footprint for firms, even relatively small firms, there is perhaps a greater possibility of designing contracts where you can credibly observe some measure of revenues or profits. Perhaps revenues is more realistic, and then tailor contracts to that. And so we have a project in Kenya where we did something like that, and a project in Pakistan which is much more about asset financing. And so you explicitly told us not to just talk about the papers and to just more give reflections on the stories behind the papers or after the paper. And so in that paper in Pakistan, we were offering asset-based financing for existing small businesses, and the amount of asset financing was about 4 times the original amount that they could borrow. So they could only borrow about $500, and we offered them up to $2,000, and we found that this had large benefits. Now, some reflections on that. When we did long-term follow-ups, we found that the benefits persisted, right? But they weren't taking off. These firms weren't 1 year rate, they weren't growing 10% in the first year. It wasn't like a story where they were completely taking off. They just kind of got to this flat area where persistently higher effects. Right? And so it made us think and people have discussed this about poverty flats and kind of getting to a certain level. And this is very much consistent with what you're talking about. There's this subset of people who are just seeking growth, but then stability, right? And in that project, although we finance assets, and the project was very much asset financing, the truth is that many firms came and told us we want working capital finance as well as the assets. And we just had to say, no, this project is not about working capital finance. And we just had to turn away a lot of firms who needed the two things together, and we just couldn't do it. And yeah, part of it is that, it's just hard to think about how to do working capital financing in a way that appeases the lender in terms of their ability to seize the collaterals, resell the collateral, etc. So it is challenging. And the second project that I want to talk about was the Kenya one. So this is a setting with a large multinational corporation within their supply chain and looking at their distributors who are selling their products. And these were often people who were just walking around selling various products, and we provided them with financing again for an asset, which was a bicycle, so that they can move around and sell more products. And we played around with different financial contract structures, and we found that the one where there's a bit more risk sharing embedded had quite a big impact. Two reflections on that project. Again, this is a bunch of people who came to us and said, we need working capital finance as well as this asset. Like, please give us working capital. And we couldn't do it, right? And we didn't do it. And so this is two projects where we've like shied away from the more difficult question of how to provide these people with working capital finance. And even these distributors weren't able to get working capital finance from their suppliers. And even the warehouses where they were buying the chewing gum from, the product is chewing gum, those warehouses who were buying it from the multinational, they were often buying very large amounts. They couldn't get working capital from the multinational, which was puzzling for us. And yeah, it's still reflecting upon that, really, like why. And perhaps there's an element of the multinational not wanting to enter into the financing space. And like financing is messy. It could be in some settings where there are regulatory barriers to actually enter into the financing space, and could be others where they just don't want to get involved in that. So that's perhaps one thing. But this reflection of often researchers finding from these novel contractual arrangements that they're doing well for the businesses, but the firms are not taking them on. It's a puzzle, right? Is it inertia within organizations that they've just like converged on a particular contractual form, and that's the norm, and it's very hard to move them away? Is it that there are incentives within the organization that work against people really innovating and designing contracts? There's interesting work at the moment on loan officers and their incentive structures, perhaps like preventing people from graduating. And so I think it's an open question, and it's one that I look forward to continuing the conversation on. And I think you're going to share some other work, that's interesting work on the boundaries of the firm and about within the firm, like often there are people sharing capital, sharing assets, etc. And so I think there's some also interesting work there, thinking about what exactly the firm, who brings the capital to the firm, who doesn't bring the capital, and how do we think about financing in that space. So you told me not to speak too much. Hopefully I obeyed that thing.
I would say, turning to Hillary is particularly well placed to follow on what you were just saying, Mohammed, on this piece of how hard it is to innovate as a financial services provider. Hillary, you have experience with an MFI and also launching new products, trying to get people to adopt innovative products within value chains. And so I wonder if you could just add some of your thoughts about, this challenge of what do we need to do to get the right kind of products available. But, it's also true, we know in so many ways, if you build it, they still won't come. How do you make sure that you get the products to the people who need them when they are innovative and a little weird? Like, one of the things I'm amazed at with Mohammed's work is how on earth they figured out how to get people to sign up for these contracts, because they're kind of weird contracts. Hillary, tell us about your experience in trying to launch new products and create new markets.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. And I'll try and pick up. There's so many themes that have come up that I agree with, and my personal experience aligns with. So, I think one of the first challenges to your question, and one of the reasons I think that we tend to have a lack of diversity of product offerings is it's expensive in a number of different ways, right? To actually design a new product and roll out a new product. Part of the reason it's expensive is because of the lack of data, right, that we have on different customer segments. And I'm on the same soapbox, Tim, about MSME. I refuse to use that term anymore. In the same way that I constantly say women is not a segment, right? And MSMEs are not a segment. And so to be able to actually get more nuanced can be quite expensive, right? So because of the lack of data, what it results in is either you get credit rationing where people just don't have access in a formal way, or you end up with very costly loan origination processes, right? You have to send a loan officer out multiple times. You're essentially recreating a cash flow statement or building a cash flow statement. And it's very expensive. And so we end up with this kind of poor product market fit in many cases. An example being that, you know, in many markets, and Mohammed mentioned Kenya is one good example, where so many people are using the very readily available short-term, high-cost consumer loans in lieu of working capital, in lieu of cash flow-based lending, right? And there's sort of an assumption that because we don't have data on these customers, that they're sort of all subprime customers. We know that that's not true. We just don't have a way to distinguish, right? Who is and who isn't. And so, you know, I do think, and I really appreciated Mohammed's, I was vigorously agreeing with Mohammed's point about it's not necessarily, you know, the Small Firm Diaries has shown that there is a large unmet demand for working capital. And sometimes when people say they don't want working capital, what they mean is, or they don't want a loan, what they mean is, I don't want what you're offering me, right? And so to make that distinction is really critical in figuring out how do we actually serve those people who could benefit from a more appropriate product and be able to pay it back. I think just on the high costs for various types of lenders, if we think about tier 1 banks, it tends to be, you know, installed physical and tech infrastructure. It's also compliance requirements that they have. They can be really burdensome. For a fintech, that could be very different. It's usually the cost of funds, right? Because they're often getting, they're using equity for lending, which is the most expensive capital you can get. And then the third would be an example of MFIs, where in many cases, unfortunately, the lack of scale means that they have very high cost to income ratios, right? But for all of them, the cost of tailoring can be really high. So again, to Mohammed's point, tailoring absolutely is what the evidence is showing us is much more effective. But to do that can be quite costly relative to the loan size. So happy to talk about different ways that, you know, at least the Gates Foundation is trying to work on these issues. But let me turn it back to you, Tim.
Thanks, Hillary. And I do just want to take a moment there to note that this isn't a developing country problem, right? This is true in every country. As Hillary was talking about the cost structures, like that's exactly the same issue that we see in the US and the UK, across Western Europe, trying to serve small firms. It's exceedingly difficult to do this because of the cost structures. And, you know, we see the prevalence in the small business lending marketplace in the United States of cash advance lending, which is a way for, you know, very high cost insertion into the payment flow, still at very high. So it's these features that harm a lot of small businesses. It's an innovative way to do financing, but it doesn't reach the goal because it is still high cost while removing a lot of risk and hard to judge what the outcomes are. So if you're not a subscriber to the 5, let me put in a plug here to subscribe to the 5, the sort of weekly newsletter, where you'll find links to a lot of these connections on these challenges. But I think, Payal, too, there is a point here. You lead the Strive community, which is Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth's effort to find ways to deliver useful services and products, financing and other things to small businesses, not just in developing countries, but across Western Europe as well. I know you could talk for like 3 hours about the many, many different organizations that you're working with, but if you were sort of trying to pick out a few lessons about how to deliver useful services to small firms that you can afford to deliver to them and to that they actually want, what is it that you've been learning in the Strive community?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think your comment on 3 hours is my cue to try to be concise, right, Tim? So very quickly, our Strive portfolio is a set of programs that's really about helping small businesses become more resilient given how much volatility there is. And I think that's one of the findings we see constantly in the Small Firm Diaries work, is that volatility is just getting worse and worse and worse for small firms. And so our hypothesis, and we stood up this portfolio in 2021, over $100 million worth of grant funding. We're in over 20 countries across low income, middle income, and high income countries. What our hypothesis was going into it was, all right, how do we help small businesses get capital, go digital, and get networks and know-how? Because when we looked at all of the things that small firms needed, it seemed to kind of coalesce around these three thematics. And so as I said, we have a number of programs across a number of different markets. I'll give you a couple of examples, and then I'll get to the richness of the learnings, because I think that is what is most exciting. So in Indonesia, we are focusing on really helping small businesses succeed in the digital economy by working with financial service providers to actually unlock access to capital. So this goes to the comments that Hillary made around the need to tailor. Financial service providers, whether they're MFIs or smaller banks or even non-bank financial institutions, they need some technical assistance in terms of understanding how to tailor products and services. And so that's one of the things we're doing in Indonesia. We're also helping small businesses with the adoption of digital. Technology hasn't been a component of this conversation yet, but we really can't ignore it given the mass acceleration to digital post-COVID. And so what we're really trying to do in Indonesia is help Indonesian small businesses adopt the right technology for them. And just like financial services, it's a question about tailoring. Most technologies are not fit for purpose when it comes to small firms. And so really understanding what's out there in the ecosystem and how to connect that to small firms is critically important. And the mechanism we found to be most useful is peer mentoring. Small firms are much more likely to listen to each other than to listen to me or to you or to the government or to an NGO or to a bank. And so we've been facilitating the creation of these networks of peer mentoring. Here in the UK, which is where I sit, we have Strive UK, which again is about this idea of resilience as the first step to getting on that path to growth. And again, it's about facilitating the right connection to technology and digital. So really helping identify what are the right product sets and services and giving small businesses hands-on technical assistance on embedding it. Because what we see in the literature, especially here in the UK, is cost is not the only barrier when it comes to technology adoption. There's kind of comfort, there's trust, there's competency and capacity. And so we've been doing a lot of kind of hand-holding of small businesses to help them through the journey of technology adoption. And then just going back to that point around capital, we've been doing a lot of work with partners like Acción and with CARE around really making sure that this becomes institutionalized in the day-to-day operations of financial service providers. So how do we help financial service providers design loans for women entrepreneurs in urban settings? How do they think differently about collateral in places like Pakistan? How do they think differently about signatories in Peru? So that gives you a very quick kind of around the world of what Strive is. I'll end with a couple of lessons. The first is I'll build on the point, Tim, you made around if they build it, they won't come. And we see that time and time again. And so one of the lessons we've seen in our program is you've actually have to put the intervention or the tool or the product where the small businesses already are. So one of the things that we do is we introduce nudges or education on digital platforms they're already using. So this might be Facebook, it might be Mercado Libre in Latin America, it might be Grab. There are already millions of micro merchants on these platforms. And so how do we take advantage of the fact that they're already there and add a small layer of additionality? So for example, with Mercado Libre, we put in small behavioral nudges to incentivize small merchants to save a little bit more when they had a larger than normal sale. With Grab, we did a lot of work to help drivers think about, okay, how might you, if you want to, evolve your kind of solo enterprise into something that's a little bit larger? Here's some curriculum. And we have found time and time again that that model works really well. Another lesson that I will mention, aside from, being intentional and going where they already are and being really customized and tailored, is that you really have to show small businesses very early in the digital journey that there's a win there. So what we find is if you don't have a good positive first use of a digital technology, you've lost them forever. But B, they have to see value really quickly. So when you think about kind of the spectrum of technological adoption, we see the most popular places to start are social selling and e-commerce, because quite quickly, these small businesses see an increase in revenue. And maybe the final lesson I'll leave you with is just that as much as I talk about digital, it's about finding the right blend of touch and tech. Even though we are increasingly in a digital economy, we can't kind of lose sight of that need to have that hand-holding or the peer mentorship or the capacity building, because trust is kind of the big macro issue I think we're all dealing with, whether it's technology, whether it's financial services. And so finding that right blend is incredibly critical. And thus ends my not 3-hour lecture, Tim.
Thanks, Payal. And I just want to mention here that one of the things that I have started thinking about a lot, and again, maybe an ad for subscribing to the 5, you're talking about a positive first experience. But we are at the same time, we are seeing this digital transition, lots of trying to help the tech and touch get into it, but now fraud at scale enabled by technology, towards a bunch of people who have a really hard time distinguishing between what is a real message from a mobile money provider and what is a fraudulent one. What are the costs how should these things work? I think Lisa Spontig is one of our participants here, and she's been doing a lot of work on that. So for others, if you just do a search for Lisa Spontig, you'll find a couple of papers that she has done on these questions.
Yeah, and Tim, just on that point, I just think we always talk about the positives of digitalization, but I do think cybersecurity is kind of the dark side of digitalization. And so one of the things we've been doing is trying to think increasingly, how do you equip small businesses with the right tools and understanding? I mean, all of us are kind of subject to attacks, and they're getting more and more sophisticated. And I think this is just going to snowball. And so kind of getting out in front of it is incredibly critical.
We spend a lot of time talking about the firms and the finance side. One of the reasons I wanted to do the Small Firm Diaries, and I'll just quickly tell the story of how the idea of the Small Firm Diaries originally came about, was I was in Rwanda for a Mastercard Foundation sponsored roundtable about diaries, and took advantage to go see the gorillas. And just entirely by happenstance, right beside the hostel I was staying at in Kinigi, Rwanda, was a small carpentry shop. And I do woodwork as a hobby, and so I was very interested, like, how does this work? And I show it, and there's a carpentry shop with a couple of machines and like 4 young men standing around with clearly an owner, and every once in a while the owner says, hey, you go do this thing, and one person stands up and does something for a while, and a little while later, hey, you go do some other thing. And I just can't wrap my head around, one is, how did I never notice that there are all these firms like this in the communities that I've been studying for years? They're not just micro enterprises, but also, how does the economics of this work? Who's paying these guys? How do they acquire their skills? How many of them are there? Are they the same guys every day? How do all the economics of this work? And so right from the beginning, one of the questions was, what are the jobs like in small firms? And Paddy, by happenstance, you recently wrote this blog post that, again, I'm very jealous that I didn't write about. We just don't know very much about jobs across the board for people of low incomes. And it seems to be a really critical thing for us to be thinking about. If we have an anti-poverty lens, we need to understand the labor markets, the labor pools, what are the jobs, who creates jobs, how good are the jobs? Can you just walk us through the questions that you are asking and why you think they matter so much?
Sure, thank you very much. So I'm going to maybe even start by taking a step back, which is that if you're a development finance institution and you're interested in jobs, SMEs are a very polarizing topic because you have some people that think, well, pretty much everybody who lives in poverty, if they're not working for themselves, they work for a tiny business. By definition, that is the most important thing that a development finance institution could be doing with their money. That's our top priority. And you have other people that go, these businesses are a dead end. All our money should be going into the larger, more productive, formal sector firms, structural transformation. We should be throwing all our money into that side of things. So when we talk about jobs, like what should we be doing to kind of, with our anti-poverty lens, to improve people's livelihoods, in the background we actually have that kind of comparison in our heads. I think that's worth bearing in mind. You very kindly mentioned that blog. We also wrote a paper called How and Why We Finance SMEs, which tries to kind of get into this question. I don't think we completely settle it. We try and make an argument that we shouldn't look at firm size in itself as a predictor of impact. And if you read it, you'll also see this theme of flexibility of terms, risk-bearing capital being very important. But for us, we're slightly larger firms. So this also matters for firms with 100 employees, 300 employees, 500 employees. So it's kind of self-evident why we care about job creation, I think. If a development finance institution or a impact investor is thinking about what it does in the language of economics, you could say that we're trying to improve people's welfare. We're trying to improve their lives. And I was thinking while you were showing me the presentation about the metrics that we have to try and capture this. So impact investors have to count things, and we count things like how many people have got a job, what are their wages. I had a quick look at the catalog of metrics that impact investors use. I couldn't see anything on there about volatility or stability. It's going to be a hard one to get at because, of course, sometimes seasonality is wanted and sometimes it is unwanted. So you couldn't just measure the seasonality in a firm and decide whether it was good or bad. But it's interesting that we don't really get at that. Now, when we invest in a large firm, it's a reasonable assumption that if we're investing in a large formal sector firm in an economy which hasn't got many of those, we're probably improving the quality of jobs on net in that economy. There might be some offsetting job destruction somewhere else in the formal sector, but we probably don't have to worry about it too much. But when we're doing something systemic, like trying to improve the supply of credit to SMEs at scale, then I think that thinking about what you might call general equilibrium effects is more your responsibility to think about that kind of question. And so getting back to the theme of changing people's lives, we don't just want to create jobs in the sense that we can say we lent this firm some money and the employment in this firm went up from 5 people to 10 people. We want to be able to create jobs in a way that is raising the welfare of people in society. And if that is, we lend money to one restaurant, it expands, another restaurant shuts down, but the person washing the dishes is still getting paid the same. In some sense, you can kind of report job creation there, but you haven't made people better off. And so this was the thing that I was griping about in the blog that you mentioned, which is that it's very hard to go out to the kind of academic literature and get a sense of whether and when improving the supply of credit to SMEs is kind of raising the quality of jobs over time across an economy. So it's a very difficult one to look at. I think maybe I'll stop, but there was one other thing that I wanted to say, which is that if anybody on this call is interested in how impact investors are thinking about these issues, there is an entity called the I think it's the International Federation for Valuing Impact, and they've just put out a proposed methodology for impact investors to assign a dollar value to the impact that they're creating by creating jobs in firms, which any economist, that should be a red rag to a bull. So go and have a look at that and see what you make of it.
I was actually just thinking, I know Jonathan is fiercely Googling that right now to look into that, because yes, these questions of impact investing and how we value things and how we measure additionality probably don't get as much attention as they should, and has been a theme of a lot of Jonathan's work over the years. But also comes back to, you know, my fascination too with the labor pools. So one of the things that you mentioned, Paddy, is if the dishwasher is the same, he just moves from job to job and gets paid the same thing. But I think one of the questions that really fascinates me is is there some lump of labor that is choosing to take a microfinance loan and start a microenterprise versus take a job in a small firm versus take a job in a large firm versus, you know, try to save up to start their own firm? Or are there subgroups within that that determine what path you take? Can people move back and forth between the paths? Are there path dependencies based on some of those choices? And we just don't know very much about that. Jonathan, with Jonathan Bauchet, had a paper many years ago in Bangladesh showing that the people who are in factories, the young women in factories in Bangladesh, or the people overall, which are also many young men, were not the same people taking microfinance loans. They were different pools, but you know, we don't know how much that applies in other places. The Chris Blattman and Stefan Durkan, I think, did an experiment on this in Ethiopia where they randomized who got a job in a big factory and who got a micro enterprise loan, and found that after a few years, everybody had quit whatever they'd started and switched to the other thing. So neither of them were really all that good options. So if you went into factory work, you decided this is a terrible job, I'm going to go start my own business. If you started your own micro enterprise, you decide I can't make any money here, let me go get a job. The interplay. So there's a lot, I think, to learn there. Hillary, I want to come back to you on some of the questions that have popped up in the Q&A, and maybe Mohammed, you can sort of weigh in on this. One of the questions is about flexible microfinance contracts, and Mohammed, you're also the editor of the Vox Dev Lit that reviews a lot of the microfinance experiments. But Hillary, there's another question too about compliance officers as part of product innovation, and I think the structure of flexible finance and what that would mean to an MFI. So, I mean, that's a fairly vague and generalized question, Hillary, but thoughts on how you get finance providers to innovate, who should be part of those teams, and what those means, and are there pathways you can work on there, but also what it would take to develop a flexible repayment within a finance operation.
Yeah, great. So, I mean, when we talk about flexibility, we can talk about it on a few dimensions, right? We can talk about flexibility in terms of the actual repayments, right? We can talk about flexibility in terms of the schedule, right? We can also talk about flexibility in terms of the amount that's being paid, right? I mean, I'm at the point where I'm old enough where I hear some movies being played over again. 25 years ago in Bolivia, with the commercial microfinance institutions there, they were sort of really trying to figure out how you can do what is effectively now cash flow financing, right? And how you can adapt the actual amount that people are paying across the loan term. Without, and I'm going to sound like a broken record, but without data, that's really hard to do, right? If we don't actually have visibility into the cash flow of the business that we're financing, recognizing that that business and the household, even when we're talking about small firms, is very fluid, right? And as we know, the financial lives of low-income people is incredibly complex. So without that data, it becomes really hard to do. And one of the challenges that we have, I think, in a lot of markets is that data tends to be siloed in different places, right? So it might be siloed on an e-commerce app, to Payal's examples, where there's a ton of data, but it lives inside a walled garden, right? Safaricom in my beloved Kenya is another example, right? Where that data is really siloed. So what is it going to take at a systemic level to unlock some of that data and make that data more free flowing? I think the challenge when you think about just the practical aspect and the operational aspect of being a lender is, particularly given what type of lender you might be, you are focused on risk. Your job is risk management, right? Well, part of your job is risk management. The other part is profit margins. And so, the question becomes, how can you do that in a way in which the risk department of the financial institution is comfortable with the data that's being used, with integrating some of that data into product design, into the credit scoring algorithm, et cetera. And some of that, as with any time we're dealing with humans, some of that just comes down to sort of perceptions, perceived fears, real fears, et cetera, that decision makers within the financial institutions will have. And so when we talked about sometimes you build it and they don't come, I 100% agree with that. I think sometimes we underestimate how much change management has to happen at some of these financial institutions to actually get there. It's not just showing the RCT and proving to them, look, we got these great results, right? Sometimes in a controlled environment that would be difficult to replicate. And, could you please now roll this out? There are so many different, both operational, technological, and human factors involved in getting that financial institution to actually change its practices and its behavior. So really need to the build it, but they don't come problem. I hope I answered your question, Tim.
You did, and Mohammed, I referenced for you and some of those, but I do think, Hillary, I really want to emphasize, a thing that I see over and over again is in the overall funding and policy space, a lack of understanding of the cost structures of financial services providers and how much they really depend on standardization. Even at the level of the people that you can hire, you can only make your organization work if your loan officers are relatively low cost, which means those loan officers are relatively low skilled, which means you have to have an entirely standardized product. You can't have a product where they are, making all sorts of changes, because then you have to pay so much higher wages that you can't afford to offer the product in the first place. And, I think that is a big gap. Mohammed, thoughts on where we are from the literature as well on product innovation and where product innovation is possible? Where do you think are the gaps in product innovation ideas that we should be trying?
Thanks, Tim. And learning a lot from listening to Hillary and Payal talk about this kind of like change management element. I mean, often as researchers, we kind of do the research, we get to the end of it, we deliver the results, and then maybe we speculate a little bit about scale up and things like this. But the real hard work of thinking about adoption and scale up, you're both doing. And I think researchers will have to engage with this more. I mean, even in the broader kind of non-development space where we're looking at experiments, I mean, people like John List have talked about the scaling up, like people needing to think about scaling from the beginning, right? And unless you have these kinds of conversations and you think about, okay, this product that I've designed, perhaps I'm going to find like a big exciting treatment effect, but does it scale, right? Will it get adopted firstly, and does it scale? I think these are like super important conversations that require more discussion. Since you've done a bit of advertising, if I can also do some advertising, and we have this special, the job of editor of this piece that we've done, the Oxford Review of Economic Policy and Microfinance, is really easy. I just find really good people to write the papers, and so we have some of them sitting in the room. And Paddy, you mentioned about general equilibrium effects. I mean, Cynthia Kinnan has written this piece on general equilibrium effects, and perhaps you can share that later, Tim, just that special piece, because that's a really nice framework for thinking about general equilibrium effects in terms of different markets. Specifically on this repayment flexibility, again, in that Oxford Review of Economic Policy piece, we have Martin Kant and Sasha Indarte wrote about a different type of flexibility, which is kind of like ex post flexibility, like when people are in trouble, giving them flexibility. And so there's this kind of, there's a literature which thinks about like ex ante flexibility, so grace periods, so like allowing people to skip the first loan or skip payments during their loan. And this is definitely one of these areas where, you know, the researchers have found really quite exciting results. Erica Field, Rohini Pandey was the early paper that found when you give people some time to repay their loan, like a couple of months off at the beginning, then they invest in kind of higher risk, higher reward investments, more kind of lumpy investments, although it led to more defaults, right? And so then you cannot, perhaps you can understand in that paper why the institution wouldn't necessarily want to implement a product which could be beneficial for the entrepreneurs in terms of higher average profits, but they're not going to benefit from the upside of the people that are doing very well, and they're only going to see the greater exposure to the downside. And then subsequent papers by Giorgio Barboni and others have again thought about this kind of like repayment flexibility, ex ante flexibility, and giving people the choice, which I think addresses one of the questions in the Q&A. And again, finding positive results. But I think all of those authors would acknowledge that these institutions are generally not taking up that product, right? And so perhaps there is a concern here about like moral hazard. But yeah, it was an interesting piece that Sasha and Martin had written on the ex post flexibility. Like, do you give that flexibility when people are in trouble, or do you give them the flexibility early? So those are really my thoughts on the flexibility.
Yeah.
Lots to be done.
Laura and I both threw the link to the new issue of Oxford Review of Economic Policy in the chat for people. For anybody who doesn't know, the hack is if you don't have access to the journal at the very high rates, just search the name of the paper, and 99% of the time you'll find the way economists work around these market imperfections is we just post the working paper versions of them for free on our own sites. And
just email us, otherwise just email us.
Yeah, they can be pretty easy to find even if you don't have access to the journal itself. I have a comment in chat from Payal. It's a question for Paddy that I think is interesting to a lot of people. So I'm going to ask it on Payal's behalf. Paddy, one of those questions is, how much does it cost to create a job? And are we better off just handing that cash to people? What is it that you're seeing, or what is it that you're not seeing on that as you think about what are the costs to create more jobs?
Well, so first of all, I was saying to Payal that sometimes these numbers are confusing because sometimes you're hearing someone talk about a labor market intervention where they're helping people find jobs, and they say it cost me this much to help a person find a job. That kind of assumes there's a firm there already that has built the buildings and the machinery or whatever for that person to have a job. So if you limit yourself to how much capital is required per job, the IFC has an estimate out. It's not really an estimate of a intervention causal impact. It's more an association. On average, a firm in their emerging markets SME dataset borrows $1 million, and that's 16.3 jobs within 2 years on average get added. But I would expect enormous heterogeneity across countries. I have a paper in mind. It was about capital subsidies for employment creation in Italy. I think it was $250,000 for one job in that country. So I mean, it's really to do with capital labor ratios, things like that inside firms. And then I'm going to do some awful self-promotion. I tried to write a paper, didn't do it very well, where I tried to compare, like, should you put money into a DFI where they invest in capital, or should you do it like a cash transfer to people if you want to make them better off? And of course, with a DFI, you put money into capital into a firm, and that creates a flow of benefits over time. Whereas if you do a cash transfer, you've got to kind of maintain the flow of that cash transfer to have a sort of comparable effect. And the other thing is, of course, that we get our money back, whereas you don't get your money back when you're doing a cash transfer. So like the full sort of value for money test of whether it's better to, whether you help people more efficiently by giving them money versus investing in capital in firms is quite a complicated one. If you want to see how I butchered that question, it's called Do DFIs Get Too Much Money, I think, and it's on the Center for Global Development website.
So of course, we've got a really great set of questions just coming here at the end as we are hitting the wrap up stage. So I just want to comment for everyone online. If you want to ask questions, do throw them into the Q&A. We can follow up with those offline. Anything that we don't get here. So do take this moment. You can always, of course, email me with other questions. The thing I want to sort of wrap up here is thinking about what are the next steps. So I'm going to ask each of you very quickly to say, what is the number one question that you have now, based on the Small Firm Diaries work and other research that's out there? What is it that you really want to know that would affect what you do next? Mohammed, because you have the least programmatic responsibility here, I'm going to ask you to start off. What do you think are the really interesting questions right now from where you sit?
Yeah, I'm going to be a little bit selfish and talk about something that actually I've been thinking about for our own work recently. And it touches a little bit on what Hilary and Payal mentioned about change management. So, I mean, I've been thinking about, so that project in Kenya, we were financing bicycles. And now I'm working on a new project where we're trying to finance e-bikes, so electrical vehicles. And so this is a setting where we can greatly reduce pollution. It's quite profitable if they can charge their vehicle. But the lenders have been reluctant to enter this space. And so like the economics of it looks very good from the perspective of drivers. If they can charge their vehicle, they save a lot in terms of their cost. It's good for the environment, etc. But the lenders have been a bit reluctant to enter this space for a variety of reasons. And one of the things that they're often saying to us in this project is that we need like guarantees, like capital guarantees, first loss guarantees. And so that's something that we're like thinking about at the moment, having discussions with like, how do we facilitate this financial institution, which is keen, but very reluctant to enter a space where they're unsure about the asset itself that's being financed and just like feeling a bit risk averse. How do we like help them along? And people have obviously thought about this much more than I have. People who've been working with DFIs. Similar things happening in a project in Pakistan where, again, building on that first project in Pakistan where we financed a variety of vehicles. And now we have a project focusing specifically on women and trying to help women finance rickshaws to become drivers. And this is something where we think it could be very beneficial for the women in terms of getting like an income generating asset and entering the transportation sector where they're underrepresented. But again, the lender is saying this is interesting, but it's risky. And like, we can't just put our capital up for this. So this is something that I'm struggling with on a few projects. And I'm sure that there are people sitting in this room who have ideas for how can we facilitate change in a more systematic way. Presumably there are institutions out there which do really like support institutions in entering riskier lending spaces.
And that, credit guarantee schemes was actually a theme of one of the questions in the Q&A. I'll also note that, earlier there was a question about, where is innovative financing happening? And I'll note that, Indonesia is a really interesting case because of Bank Rakyat and the Indonesian government's work on trying to push small business finance. But it's also emblematic of a lot of the challenges here is that there is the KUR program in Indonesia that was explicitly designed to require banks to make more loans to small businesses and to eliminate collateral requirements. In practice, you see the banks just kept the collateral requirements. They just ignored the fact that they weren't supposed to have collateral requirements. My friend Salman Alibi with the World Bank is doing some work on this, so keep an eye out for a paper on the evolution of the KUR program. And we'll feature that in the 5 when that does come along. Payal, what is it that you really want to know as you continue to make investments through the Strive program?
Yeah, so I think there's still so much work to do in terms of understanding the opportunities of being innovative when it comes to financing. And the reason I'm talking about this is we're seeing a proliferation of green financing opportunities, but I don't understand yet what impacts that has and what opportunity that has for small firms. My hypothesis is that all of the kind of green agenda just adds more things on the shoulders of small firms. And does this then become yet another distraction? And so I think green financing is, I have a lot of questions about that. And then of course, we're doing a lot of work to try to understand the opportunities and costs of embedded finance. I think there's so much around lending within digital platforms, and I'm really bullish about it, but I have yet to figure out, and we're working with lots of partners to try to figure out how does this work at scale with the right protections in place for borrowers and that right flexibility.
Paddy, in some ways you have answered this question at length in the blog post. What is it that you want to know about jobs? But any other things that are top of mind for you about what you want to know about small firms, small firm credit, small firm growth, et cetera?
So there's maybe I'll allow myself two answers. One is what I like to know and what would my employer like to know. So what I would like to know is I would like all you academic researchers out there to be asking the same questions of slightly larger firms. So the importance of risk-bearing capital equity, but for medium-sized firms for development in Africa, let's say. I don't read anything about that, more or less. I mean, I haven't seen much about that. And then what would we like to know? I mean, you talked about vendor financing. Now, at the moment, BII, we want to do vendor financing. We work with the bank. The bank has a client who is, I don't know, a catering equipment supplier, and we help the catering equipment supplier sell their equipment on credit to their customers. But I don't know, and I think we would like to know whether there are other routes to market we could find there for doing vendor financing. And again, you talked about working capital. So, I mean, I often quite hear, just as you said, like short-term loans being described as working capital lending, just like little one-off fixed loans. But I think that what you have in mind is more like, at least in the UK, what we'd call an overdraft, right? Like a balance that you can run up and down when you want to. And again, I think the same question there is like, basically, if we want to get more of that out there, how do we do it? Like, where are the companies? Who are the people that we give our capital to, and they're going to use it in that way? I think we'd love to know more about
that. Hillary, I'm going to give you the last word. So just sort of chime in with my own answer to this question, because it does align. I mentioned I really, really want to understand the labor markets. But I also, as Paddy is saying, very much in this, one, it looks to me like working capital is the big missing ingredient. However, I want to see some experiments on working capital to see what happens. Just because it looks like that's the missing ingredient, you don't really know how much that's going to help until you start offering working capital. And really interested in a variety of ways of delivering working capital lending, as Paddy was saying, either by working with suppliers, as having the suppliers be the credit evaluators lend to these people, but not to these people, because the suppliers generally know who their best customers are, or as Payal was saying, embedded finance, the organizations are providing other services that have a little bit more insight, or any other way that we can find to try to offer some of these run up, run down, flexible repayment, semi-equity contingencies, and how that works with banks. So that's where I put myself. Hillary, I'll give you the last word on what new questions that you want to know to drive strategy at the Gates Foundation.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Tim. So couple things. I mean, the one of the many soapboxes that I'm on is about data, right? And what are the different channels to both access the data, and how can we create environments in which we can more easily share data, which will have benefits beyond probably what we can even imagine right now. I mean, certainly the examples of being able to lower cost, to improve the tailoring, as we talked about, but I'm certain there are more that we don't even know are going to happen. The second is partly to your point, Tim, around distribution channels, and also Payal mentioned this, is how do we actually reach the customers and find innovative ways to reach customers, recognizing both the opportunities and the limitations of certain channels. I worry a lot. In almost every market that I go to, there's a conversation at some point about what more can we have agents do, right? And the concern is, okay, we can't, there's diminishing returns at a certain point, right? Of trying to get particularly lower skilled agents to suddenly, if they're mobile money agents, to suddenly become loan officers, for example. That's a tough ask. So what are the channels that are actually viable for us to reach customers? And particularly, we recently looked at the agriculture sector and different value chains and looked at value chain financing and made an attempt to estimate how much is actually happening. And it was much larger than we had expected, which is exciting. But at the same time, how do you actually leverage both the data that's in those value chains and that channel in a way that doesn't actually break the channel? So that's probably more than you bargained for, Tim, but those are just a few of the questions I had.
Excellent. So I'm going to throw up one final screen here as we wrap up. Thank you to everyone who paid attention to us for all this time. You can find a lot of the details, as I mentioned, at smallfirmdiaries.org, where there is this much deeper set of slides that walk you through all of the findings and the recommendations. Designed that way to make it easy for people to use some of those slides. But if there are other things that you have questions about or would be useful to you in your work, please do feel free to reach out to the team. Want to take a moment just to say thank you to Lyft and MFO. MFO is now the Global Worker Dialogue, who are instrumental in doing the field work for the Small Firm Diaries, and to the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Argydius Foundation, Andy and UNISCAP and FSD Kenya for helping fund the work in the first place. And finally, a thank you to all of the panelists here for offering your insights. I hope you learned some things from listening along the way, but we'll look forward to continuing to engage on these questions. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We will do a follow-up email with the rest of the questions that we didn't get to, providing some links and resources. Feel free to send on any questions that come up afterwards as well. And please do think about subscribing to the 5 if you are interested in these questions, if you're not already. Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.